the apocalypse. When an entire people are destroyed or destroy themselves. The end of civilization. For us today, as we go about our daily lives, it's barely something we consider. We're so sure it couldn't happen to us. But for some civilizations, it already has. As the medieval kings of Europe battle for supremacy, and the feudal soldiers of Japan, the samurai, wrestle control of their country, so Central America sees the birth of one of the greatest civilizations it has ever known. The Aztecs. Warriors, empire builders, innovators. From approximately 1325 CE, the Aztecs dominate Central America. Their capital city is built on an island and has a population of 140,000 people.
It is the most incredible place.
Everything is white and then painted different colors. It is beautiful.
Their empire is underpinned by a system of tribute payments and conscription from their conquered lands, and numbers around 6 million people. They build incredible architecture. They develop sophisticated politics, writing systems, calendars, and a religion that requires huge numbers of bloody human sacrifice. But in 1519, Aztec dominance is put to the test when the Spanish Empire land on the coast and a small army of around 500 conquistadors attack the capital. Within a few decades, the entire Aztec Empire vanishes.
The loss is just unimaginable to us in world history.
But now, new science is revealing astonishing new clues
We were just amazed.
to the reasons why the Aztec people were wiped from history.
It's new chapters in human history.
So we ask the question, what is the ancient apocalypse that destroys one of Central America's greatest empires? Our story begins in Mexico in 1884. Young American archaeologist Zelia Nuttall arrives in the country and begins to explore its ancient history.
Nuttall is a really interesting character because she approaches archaeology in a very different way to her contemporaries, who are mainly male, pretty much all men.
Zelia was absolutely a pioneer, and she was having to forge her way in a man's world.
She's an amazing woman who was responsible for much incredible research into the indigenous peoples of Mexico. She was recognized as an archaeologist, as an anthropologist.
At the time, the ancient Aztecs, who called themselves the Mexica, were not considered to be an important civilization worthy of study. They were too brutal or primitive.
In the late 19th century and early 20th century, Aztec culture, in fact, all the cultures of Mesoamerica, were considered to be not really on a par with other great civilizations of the world, ancient Egypt or the ancient Greeks or Rome, for example.
Zelia approaches archaeology from a brand new perspective. So she actually bothers to learn the Nahuatl language, the ancient language of the Aztecs. She understands them, and that gives her a huge access to understanding the Aztec civilization.
There is one site in particular that captures Zelia's imagination. Just a few miles north of Mexico City, Teotihuacan. With huge pyramids, streets lined with temples and spread over a vast area. Its ancient history is shrouded in mystery. Zelia explores the edges of the site and finds a hidden area.
We see her starting to collect some of the terracotta artifacts. Prior to that, a lot of these artifacts had been overlooked as definitely not important for serious scholars to write about. And Zelia Nuttall said, no, this is really complex, very interesting culture, and we need to pay attention to it.
Zelia Nuttall published quite widely. She was responsible for transforming the way people understand Teotihuacan.
It was later found that the Aztecs considered Teotihuacan to be a sacred place, although it was much more ancient than the Aztecs themselves.
Zelia's research and her ability to bring the civilization to life for the first time awakens an enormous interest in the people of Mexico. She actually thought this was a civilization equal to the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians.
But there is one question that she cannot answer. What happened to the Aztecs? And it's a student of Nuttall's that takes on the quest to discover how the Aztecs rise and fall. Mexico City, 1909. Young archaeologist Manuel Gamio is studying at the National Museum.
Manuel Gamio is a fascinating figure because he is very responsible for restoring respect to indigenous history.
Gamio explores the Valley of Mexico and learns the ancient Nahuatl language.
He travels very broadly, looking at different sites, working with indigenous people.
But it's not in the hills and valleys of his home country where Gamio makes a discovery that will change history. Mexico City, 1914. Gamio's search is on for the lost capital of the Aztecs, known as Tenochtitlan.
For hundreds of years, nobody knew exactly where the ancient city was. They knew that the city of Mexico City had been built on top of it. They knew that it was a shining temple right in the center. But where was that center?
There was a house in the historic quarter that was being demolished, and Gamio took the opportunity to excavate in the basement.
He goes to this place and he actually digs a trench there.
And what they discovered was the edge of a mural, clearly dating to the Aztec period. And they also found this really huge base of what they thought was some kind of very important ritual or temple structure. Manuel Gamio said, hang on a minute, maybe I've just stumbled across the corner of the Grand Temple, the sacred heart of Aztec culture.
And from that, he thinks, if we should just excavate a bit more, we could find the whole thing, we could work out the map of the city.
This could be the legendary city of the Aztecs.
But then he wasn't allowed to excavate further.
The city's building authorities don't allow a whole city block to be knocked down and dug up.
And so he was stymied. This tantalizing corner of archaeology that suggested a whole Aztec city just resting under the modern city.
And so the temple's ruins are left unexamined, and the secrets it holds of the lost civilization remain unknown. Our search continues in Mexico City. It's 1978. And amidst the bustling, sprawling metropolis of more than 12 million people, any chance of finding the sacred center of the Aztecs' capital seems to be further away than ever. When, on the 21st of February, workers for the city's electric company are digging in a street in the heart of the city.
They've gone 2 meters down already, and then all of a sudden one of the diggers hits an enormous stone. And they realise that this stone is carved.
At first, they only see a tiny fragment of stone, and then the more earth they move, the bigger it gets and the more they reveal. They end up uncovering a disc over 3.5 meters in diameter. It is enormous.
Archaeologists are called to the site, and they are amazed by what they uncover. The massive stone disc weighs 8 tons, and carved upon it is the strange image of a woman. Who is she? In the decades since the time of Gamio and Zelianutl, other Aztec temples had been uncovered across Mexico. And now, here was a major discovery, but this time in the heart of the capital city. Archaeologists begin to decode the imagery of the disc, and that's when they recognize her as the legendary Aztec goddess, Coyolxauhqui.
Coyolxauhqui was the sister of Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the Aztec patron god. And the Coyolxauhqui stone tells the story of her defeat.
The story of the defeated goddess reveals a critical clue to the archaeologists, because she is usually placed at the foot of a great Aztec pyramid. The question is, what is she doing here in the center of Mexico City? Then, nearby, archaeologists find something else unexpected. What appears to be the ruins of a vast ancient structure.
Immediately, the archaeologists know exactly what this means. They have found the ancient temple that stood in the center of the Aztec capital.
Here was the site of the once grand temple of the Aztecs, known as the Templo Mayor.
It's the most extraordinary discovery, a real chance find.
They found the cornerstone of the temple right there. They knew at last that this mystery was going to be solved.
It becomes a unique archaeological investigation.
They destroy quite a few houses because the difficulty here is that they're excavating in the middle of the city. This is why nobody's done it before. It's only in later years that the extent of the site becomes clear and how many ritual buildings there are around there.
As well as the grand architecture, over 7,000 artifacts are found. And human skeletons. The first evidence to support the old Spanish accounts of human sacrifices being thrown down the steps of the Aztec temples. The discovery of the Templo Mayor is hailed as one of the greatest discoveries in history. But what happened for this city to be lost for so long? Why did it disappear? The answer could lie in the layout of the ancient city itself. Based on new discoveries and clues from ancient texts, we can now piece together the size and shape of the ancient Aztec city and its empire. At its peak, around 1519 to Tenochtitlan is a city of astonishing size, around 13 square kilometers, with a population of over 140,000, 3 times larger than London at the time. It is a city of great complexity, built on an island of reclaimed swampland, with causeways leading from the mainland to the center. It is a city of astounding beauty, with towering pyramids painted in bright red and blue. The Aztecs consider the middle of the city as the center of their own universe.
They basically engineered floating islands.
It is the most incredible place.
And the city is at the center of a vast empire that spans 200,000 square kilometers of what is Mexico today, and with a huge population.
The Aztec Empire at its height encompassed maybe as many as 6 million people.
But to answer the question, what happened to the Aztecs for them to be lost to history, we first need to ask, who are the Aztec people? Historian Dr. Caroline Dodds-Pennock thinks the key to unlocking the fate of the Aztecs may be hidden in the writings of the time. It's the first step to understand what we know about their society and how we know it.
It's a culture where I think it's so often misunderstood. One of the problems we have in understanding Aztec culture is that all of the documents from Tenochtitlan were destroyed by the Spanish. The loss is just unimaginable to us in world history. That means that you're always having to disentangle the sources to try and see past the Spanish perspective.
The few records that remain are written after the Spanish conquest by survivors of the civilization. Each book is called a codex, and they reveal critical clues in our investigation.
Aztec society is really fascinating because it combines quite a strong hierarchy with a degree of social mobility. So you have a pyramid where at the head of it is the ruler, what's often called the emperor.
He is revered almost like a god. One of the greatest of the Aztec kings is Moctezuma II. And at the bottom of the society are the slaves, followed by the common people. They work as fishermen or farmers, feeding the population with corn, beans, and tomatoes, among other parts of a varied diet like vanilla and chocolate. The codexes also reveal that women play a prominent role in Aztec society.
This is a society where men and women are considered equally important and effective, but in different spheres. But their responsibilities are considered equally important. So men are influential in the field of warfare, in public affairs, but women hold really tangible markers of influence. They are doctors, they are midwives, they're marketplace overseers who provision the army.
You had women who were as equally, if not more, educated than the men, who were doing the basic roles of keeping the city going. And without them, there would be no Aztec civilization.
But there's one aspect of Aztec society which dominates their lives. War.
Warfare is something that's really central to Aztec identity, as well as to the way their society operates. So even women see themselves as warriors and are part of that war effort. When you give birth to a baby, it's talked about as carrying the small shield and capturing the baby. So the whole city is structured towards this idea of expansionism.
From the time of the foundation of the Aztecs' capital city, Tenochtitlan, in 1325 CE, They expand their empire through alliances and conquest, eventually ruling over 200,000 square kilometers of territory. They subjugate other tribes, demand tribute from them, and enact human sacrifice on prisoners of war.
I think most people think of the Aztecs as being ferocious because of their reputation for human sacrifice. But the Aztecs believed that the world would come to an end if they didn't give blood to the gods. And so they believed that in order to keep the world going, they had to offer blood and hearts to feed the gods.
Although the Aztecs rule over most of what is now central Mexico, all is not peace and harmony in the empire. Several states remain independent, and some are actively hostile to their expansionist neighbors. Among the Aztecs' enemies are the Tlaxcalans, the Totopecs, and the Metztitlans. The old histories tell us that in 1521, the destruction of Tenochtitlan marks the death of the Aztec world. But what kills them? What exactly happens to the 6 million Aztecs who seem to just disappear? Dr. Dodds-Pennock then looks to one particular historical source for more clues. It's a book written in the years after the conquest by a Spanish friar called Bernardino de Sahagún.
Bernardino de Sahagún is a Franciscan friar who travels to Mexico in the late 1520s.
He's sent out to convert the natives, these barbarians, to kind of raise them up as much as they can be to some semblance of civilization. But I don't think that's what Bernardino Sahagún is doing.
So what exactly is Sahagún doing?
He collaborates with indigenous people and interviews hundreds of surviving people after the conquest.
Sahagún is one of the few foreign witnesses of Aztec life. And during his journey through Mexico, his views about the Aztecs' old ways change.
He obviously thinks that they are a true civilization, that they are something to be admired.
He considers the Aztec people creations of God that were perfect in their own right. They didn't need fixing. They didn't need to be converted. This eventually is translated into a 12-volume masterpiece called The General History of the Things of New Spain. It's an absolute work of genius. It captures a moment in time.
But it's Sahagún's account of the Spanish conquest that reveals the most critical clues of what kills off the Aztecs.
The traditional story of the conquest, the one that people have heard, is that a small band of plucky conquistadors arrive in Mexico and so conquer the city.
That's the story that's been handed down through history.
The trouble with this story is that it only emerges in the sources between 30 and 50 years after the conquest. There's no evidence that this is what indigenous people at the time believed was happening.
So what really happened during the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs? The chronicles record that in February 1519, Spanish General Hernán Cortés lands off the coast of what we call Mexico today, with 11 ships carrying around 500 men.
Cortés would have heard about Columbus's discoveries, and he wanted in on this. He wanted some of that glory, some of the wealth of the New World. So he sails off and comes in contact with Mexico. For Europeans, this would have turned their world upside down. They have no concept of a world outside of Europe. So it would be like going to another planet.
Cortés's mission? To conquer this new world. He might only have a small army, but they come armed with new technologies. Steel blades and guns.
They were suited in armor. They had new types of weaponry that the Aztec were unfamiliar with. And they had these enormous horses, which were quite terrifying for people because they had no idea what they really were.
It's not long before Cortés knows what his ultimate target is.
Cortés has heard about this incredible city, this shining beacon of a city, this thing that's unlike anything else.
That city is Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs, and their king, Moctezuma II. But Tenochtitlan is over 1,200 kilometers away. To get there, Cortés must travel through regions belonging to other tribes. In March, he arrives at the city of Potonchan. This belongs to another civilization in eastern Mexico, the Maya, one of the Aztecs' many enemies. After a bloody battle, the city is taken. The defeated Maya give Cortés gifts of gold, but also something else.
Something incredibly important happens. He is given a group of indigenous women.
And among these women is the one who will affect Aztec history forever. This is La Malinche, or as the Aztecs call her, Malintzin.
Malintzin is perhaps the most intriguing character of the Aztec story that you've perhaps never heard of.
This mysterious woman appears throughout the history of the fall of the Aztec Empire. But who was Malintzin?
She was a Nahuatl woman, an indigenous woman from the East Coast, and she was initially given to Hernán Cortés as a slave. But very quickly, it became clear that there was a lot going on up here, and she very quickly learned Spanish. And because she could speak the indigenous languages as well, Cortés started to use her as a translator.
She was able to act as an interpreter, but more than just being an interpreter, she was able to advise strategically as well.
It meant that he dodged things like raids and attacks, and that added to this sense of his sort of mystical supremacy, that he somehow had this destiny to survive and succeed.
In the indigenous sources, she is the one often who appears at the front, as if she's the person who's in charge.
Malintzin meets tribal leaders who have been oppressed by the Aztecs. She negotiates with them, introducing them to the Spanish and explaining their plans to overthrow the Aztec Empire.
So she's really, really central to the progress of the conquest.
With Malintzin as his aide throughout 1519, Cortés moves ever closer to his goal, Tenochtitlan. First, he allies with the Tlaxcalans, sworn enemies of the Aztecs. Then he takes the city of Cholula, a city allied to the Aztecs, and a jewel in the crown of the empire. Then finally, in November 1519, Cortés has Tenochtitlan in his sights. Is this the moment that will see the collapse of the Aztec Empire? The Aztec ruler, Moctezuma, is expecting him.
When there are first reports of the Spanish landing on the coast, he's getting reports on pictographic text. He's seeing what's happening all the time.
The fear builds. And there's this sense that these strange-looking incomers who kind of surge through the landscape almost fearless are something almost supernatural.
When Cortés arrives at Tenochtitlan, he is overwhelmed by the beauty of the city. It is unlike any other. He's never seen anything like it. These huge temples, everything is white and then painted different colors. It is beautiful. He must have been really nervous. He must have been amazed. Look how rich this place is.
When the conquistadors do come to the city, Moctezuma puts on a grand display of his own power.
Cortés expects to meet a mighty and fearsome warrior who's going to kind of attempt to show Cortés who's the boss. But actually what he meets is a leader in all his elaborate finery, giving him gifts.
With Malintzin acting as translator and diplomat, this is a moment that could decide the fate of the Aztecs.
This was a meeting that changed the course of history.
It's very much a clash of cultures.
So on the one hand, you have these Europeans coming in who are thinking tactically and strategically, and we have to put a strong foot forward and show our power, show our might.
And Moctezuma was there to maintain the status quo.
And so it was a collision course.
Cortés is brought into the city by Moctezuma, and they're given an old palace to live in, given food, treated very, very hospitably.
He puts them up in royal apartments as kind of honored guests.
The problem for the Aztecs is, once the Spanish are in the city, they begin to plot for their ultimate goal: to take the empire and all its riches.
Within a week, Cortés had essentially kidnapped Moctezuma.
Cortés starts treating Moctezuma as a puppet ruler.
Will Moctezuma's own actions backfire and lead to the collapse of the Aztec Empire? May 1520. Inside the Aztecs' capital city, the Aztec warriors are growing weary of the Spanish presence.
There is a nervous tension going on.
This nervous tension eventually breaks out into a full-scale revolt. Under the cover of darkness and defying the Spanish weaponry, the Aztecs force the conquistadors out of the city. But in the fighting, the Aztec Emperor, Moctezuma, is killed. And a new emperor is crowned, Moctezuma's younger brother. Cortés, wounded and defeated, retreats. He vows to return even stronger. But when he does, Cortés finds that the Aztecs are hit by a silent killer, one that could be the answer to the end of the Aztec Empire. Spring 1521. Cortés recruits an army of Tlaxcalans, the sworn enemies of the Aztecs, and begins to besiege the capital, Tenochtitlan. But then, the sources reveal, something worse has already hit the city. A plague.
Tenochtitlan suffers an epidemic of smallpox in the autumn, which absolutely devastates a city that is already under siege.
They'd never seen a disease like this before, and because they hadn't seen it before, they had no immunity.
There's one account that describes the Indians as dying in heaps like bedbugs. You've got this invisible plague that's killing whole families. It is a vision of the apocalypse.
Now, the Aztecs face not only a deadly epidemic, one carried by the invading forces, but they also have the enemy at the gates.
The Spanish cut Tenochtitlan off. They cut off the water supply, they cut off all deliveries of food and so on.
People talk about eating wood and mud to try and survive the siege as it is, and then imagine smallpox on top of that.
It's a completely apocalyptic vision, and there's some speculation that something like 200,000 people perished during that period of the conflict.
And it's at this point that the Spanish strike. August 1521. The Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. A battle erupts.
This is a battle for not just the survivors getting out alive, it's a battle for the sacred heart of their culture, it's a battle for their gods, and the writing really is on the wall. If Tenochtitlan falls, that's it.
More than 40,000 Aztecs are killed or captured, until there are no more warriors to fight. The emperor surrenders and is later executed. The city falls.
Tenochtitlan, this great, incredible jewel, is absolutely in ruins by the end of the siege. It's rubble.
It's the end of the Aztec Empire. This is the apocalypse.
Cortés has his prize.
The Spaniards occupied the city and set about basically tearing it down bit by bit.
With the Spanish having achieved their victory, with the help of Malintzin, she joins the Spanish nobility, marrying a captain in Cortés's army and securing her place in the new order. The Spanish now have a stranglehold on the region. Over the next few years, Tenochtitlan becomes known as Mexico City. And what was once the Aztec Empire becomes the colony New Spain. So here is the solution to what killed the Aztecs. Defeated by European weapons, decimated by disease, and outnumbered by enemies, the Aztec civilization appears to be dead. But when historians take a closer look at Sahagun's accounts, they find something deeply unexpected. The Aztec Empire might be dead, but many millions of Aztecs continue to live for at least another 20 years, until the middle of the 16th century. And only then, from around 1545, is there a dramatic, sharp decline in the indigenous population. Sahagun's codexes may paint a critically important picture of Aztec life, but ultimately, they are unable to answer the question, what causes the ancient apocalypse of the Aztecs? It seems that without some radical new thinking, the solution will remain lost in the ruins of the Aztec Empire. Professor David Staley studies trees, and in particular, tree rings.
It's an amazing thing. If you cut a tree down and you see these concentric bands, those are annual rings. The width of the ring is an environmental signal. It's telling you something about the conditions under which the tree grew.
It's a science called dendrochronology.
I always insist that dendrochronology is the most accurate and precise dating method in all of geochronology. So the tiny rings, the thin rings, represent drought years, and the fat rings represent wet years. And so that unique sequence of drought year, wet year, drought year, wet year, which is kind of a random walk through time back into prehistory.
A small sample is taken.
Then we bring the core samples back to the lab so that under the microscope you can see each cell.
This analysis allows him to build a picture of the climate at the time of the Aztecs' interaction with Cortés, and critically, after the event. If the Spanish capture of the capital city is not ultimately responsible for the collapse of the Aztec people, perhaps analysis of the climate of the time could give an answer. Professor Staley creates his climate picture by studying a tree that is specific to the region and is even named after an Aztec king. The Montezuma bald cypress tree.
They're gigantic, and they're old.
Some of them are over 1,000 years old. And what he finds is something incredible.
The study that we conducted using the 1,000-year-old trees identified 4 major megadroughts. That loosely means a drought more severe, more sustained than any drought witnessed in the modern instrumental era.
For the Aztecs, a mega drought not only means a loss of water, but also the chance of famine.
In circumstances where a civilization might experience a mega drought, the loss of that nutrient-rich soil, the invasion of pests which may consume their crop systems, means that that community really struggles to survive.
As well as fighting the Spanish and new diseases. In the decades after the conquest, the Aztecs had to fight simply to eat. But there's a problem. According to Staley's research, the Aztecs had survived at least 3 mega droughts before. So if the mega drought of 1545 is not solely to blame, then what causes the Aztec population to start dying out? What else happens to the Aztecs in 1545? 2018, the Max Planck Institute, Leipzig, Germany. Professor Johannes Krause and his team are looking for clues to how the Aztecs died out. 2 decades after the arrival of Cortés, and around the same time of the mega drought. And they are looking in the Aztecs' DNA.
So we are extracting DNA from remains from the past. It's really exciting, a lot of new insights about the history of the human populations in the world. And it's basically new chapters, I would call it, in human history.
In a way, it's traveling back in time. So we have the privilege of working with this time machine, which we can use to travel back to the past and ask these questions on how things were before. But on the other hand, there are some mysteries that are still unsolved.
One of those mysteries is, what wiped out the Aztec people in 1545? Records speak of an epidemic appearing in the highlands of Mexico, killing as many as 800,000 indigenous people. The illness is characterized in the records by high fever, headache, and bleeding from the nose, ears, and mouth, and acute abdominal pain. These are not the symptoms of smallpox, which ravaged the capital Tenochtitlan decades before. The Aztecs call this mysterious new disease Cocolitzli.
Cocolitzli is the local name of this outbreak. that happened in the mid of the 16th century. It started around 1545.
So what is this strange disease? And is this what brings an end to the Aztec people? To answer this question, Professor Krause and his team collect samples from a recently excavated gravesite in central Mexico called Tepozcalula Yacunda and dated to 1545. They use a new DNA screening technique known as the Megan alignment tool.
It can take DNA fragments and compare that to a database and say to what bacterial species do certain DNA fragments match to.
This system can process hundreds of millions of sequencing reads within only a few hours.
What we are doing here is analyzing past events.
And the results are stunning. The team identifies something completely unexpected: the bacteria of Salmonella.
In the majority of cases, we found Salmonella enterica.
Why that's unexpected is because Salmonella causes typhoid fever, and that's never been detected before. It's a bacteria brought to the New World by European settlers via an unexpected host: farmyard pigs. The Spanish have built up an immunity to it over hundreds of years in Europe. But typhoid is deadly to people who have no immunity.
By ingesting contaminated food or contaminated water, you take up the bacteria into your intestine, and people die pretty horrific deaths within a very short time.
So when over 200,000 European colonists settle in the New World in the 16th century, they bring something new themselves: a whole host of deadly diseases, like typhoid and smallpox. It becomes known as the Great Dying, and the numbers are astonishing.
We know for sure that it was probably something around 85 to 90% of the indigenous populations.
It's probably the largest event that we know of in human history where something like that happened.
I don't think we have an understanding of just what an apocalypse it was for the people. It was utterly tragic. Millions died.
That's astonishing. I mean, that's an apocalypse on the people of the Americas.
For the Aztecs, the Great Dying is their ancient apocalypse.
We can look at the pages of the history books and see what fate befell the Aztecs and go, oh, look, terrible pandemics. Oh, look, political and economic inequality that builds an elite higher and higher whilst the masses suffer. We should really beware, because if there's one thing that history teaches us about the way that civilizations rise and fall, is that the fall is calamitous and brings with it waves of destruction and suffering.
By the end of the 16th century, most of the Aztec people have disappeared from the face of the earth. The time of the Aztecs and their empire is over. Spanish colonization of what was once Aztec land leads to the birth of the nation of Mexico 3 centuries later. But surprisingly, if you dig into Mexico today, you'll find that the Aztec legacy lives on. And hidden among the 126 million people who make up Mexico today are those who survived the destruction of Aztec life. They are now called the Nahua people.
There are many Nahua people, 1 million Nahua speakers across Mexico today. These are the ancestors of living civilizations.
Many of them direct descendants of one of the mightiest empires in the Americas, the Aztecs.